The night Clara Ashford agreed to marry a stranger, the snow was already falling in Colorado. She didn't know that yet. She was still in Boston, still standing in a doorway that smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather, and the silence that follows violence, specific weighted unlike any other kind of silence in the world. Still watching the man she had known all her life wipe a blade clean on another man's jacket as casually as a butcher finishing his work. She would think about that moment for years afterward. Not the blood, not the body, but the casualness of it. The way Victor Hargrove set the letter opener down on the corner of the mahogany desk with a small, precise click. The way he straightened his cuffs. The way he turned to look at her with eyes that held no more expression than two pale stones at the bottom of a winter river. "Well," he said, "this is unfortunate." That was all. Not panic, not regret. Just a mild inconvenience, the way a man might speak of rain ruining a planned afternoon. Clara did not scream. She had assisted her father in surgery since she was 15 years old. She had seen men lose fingers, lose limbs, lose the light behind their eyes on operating tables that smelled of ether and copper. She understood the architecture of the human body well enough to know that Thomas Crane, slumped forward across the desk, with the back of his jacket soaked through in dark red, was beyond any help she could offer. She understood something else as well. The danger in this room was not behind her. It was in front of her. It was looking at her with those flat, patient eyes, and it was calculating. Clara Ashford did not run. She stood in the doorway and she breathed slowly and deliberately, the way her father had taught her to breathe, when everything inside her wanted to collapse. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Steady. Think. Victor crossed to the window and looked down at Beacon Street below, where Boston moved through its ordinary November afternoon entirely unaware of what had just happened 2 stories above it. Carriages passed. A vendor called out prices for roasted chestnuts. A woman in a green coat walked a small dog along the cobblestones. Life continuing, indifferent. Thomas Crane, Victor said without turning from the window, had a very unfortunate habit of keeping records of things that were none of his concern. Clara said nothing. He wanted to involve the authorities. Victor finally turned. He moved to a cabinet, withdrew a bottle of brandy, poured a single glass. He did not offer one to Clara. That couldn't be allowed. "You killed him," Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "I resolved a problem," Victor said, "which is something I have always been rather good at." He drank, set the glass down, and studied her the way a man studies a chess piece. He is deciding whether to move or to sacrifice. Your presence here, however, creates a new one. The trap closed around her quietly. No thunder, no drama, just a door shutting. But what Victor said next was the thing that broke something open inside her chest, something that had been sitting there for 3 months, since the August morning she had stood at her father's graveside and watched them lower the most important person in her life into the earth. Something that had never quite made sense about the timeline of his illness. The speed of it, the nature of the symptoms in those final weeks that had troubled her even then, even in her grief. Victor set his glass down on the side table. "Your father," he said, "was a stubborn man. When I approached him about the estate arrangements, he refused to cooperate. He had opinions about what was rightfully yours." A faint pause. "I found that inconvenient, so I was patient, 6 months patient." The room went very still. Clara heard the words. She understood them immediately, precisely, with the clinical part of her mind that her father had spent years training. She understood what patient meant. She understood what 6 months meant, laid against the arc of her father's decline, the symptoms that had never quite fit the consumption diagnosis, the way he had weakened faster than any consumption patient she had ever read about in her father's medical texts. "You poisoned him," she said. Victor neither confirmed nor denied. He simply looked at her with those flat, pale eyes and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Clara thought in that moment that she understood what hatred felt like. Not the hot, wild variety she might have expected, but something cold and very precise. A tool being picked up and held. A purpose being formed. She did not let it show on her face. Not one fraction of it. Victor laid out the terms with the efficiency of a man who had planned this conversation well in advance. She would marry Lawrence Duvall, a business associate of his, a man of 52, who had called on Clara twice since her father's death with condolences that had felt like assessments. She would marry him quietly and quickly, and in return, Victor would ensure that the matter of Thomas Crane's death would remain exactly where it was in this room between the two of them. If she refused, Victor would go to the police that evening. He would tell them that Clara Ashford had been involved with Thomas Crane, that a dispute had turned violent, that he himself had arrived to find her standing over the body, with blood on her dress, too hysterical to explain herself coherently. He would express great sorrow. He would be believed. He was a respected businessman with deep connections to the city's legal establishment, and she was a 22-year-old woman with no male protector, no family money, and a dress that was at this moment soaked in a dead man's blood. 3 days, Victor said. Think it over carefully, Clara. I am not without mercy. She did not tell him what she thought of his mercy. She walked out of that office with her back straight and her hands steady, and she did not look back at Thomas Crane's body, and she did not allow herself to feel anything until she was 4 blocks away, standing on the corner of a street she did not immediately recognize. And then she leaned against the cold brick of a building, and she shook for approximately 30 seconds. 30 seconds. That was all she allowed. Then she straightened and she began to think. Agnes Whitfield lived in a narrow boarding house on a side street that smelled of coal smoke and cabbage. 3 rooms on the 2nd floor that she had occupied since her retirement from 15 years of nursing in the Ashford household. She was 62 years old, built like a woman who had spent her life doing difficult things with gray hair, pinned back with ruthless efficiency, and eyes that had seen enough of the world to be surprised by almost none of it. She opened the door, looked at Clara's face, looked at the stain on the front of her dress, and stepped aside without a word. Later, after Clara had washed and changed into borrowed clothes and sat at Agnes's small kitchen table with a cup of tea she couldn't taste, she told the whole of it. Agnes listened without interrupting. Outside, November pressed against the windows, and the wax lamps came on in the street below. When Clara finished, Agnes was quiet for a long moment. Lawrence Duval, Agnes said finally in the tone of a woman accessing an unpleasant memory. His first wife died 18 months after the wedding. His second lasted 11 months. Both were young women. Both deaths were called accidents. She paused. Both of their families were paid quietly and discouraged from asking questions. Clara set her teacup down. You need to disappear, Agnes said. Not hide, disappear. Go somewhere Victor's money and Victor's connections cannot reach. She stood and went to her bedroom and came back with a small leather purse that she set on the table between them. Clara didn't touch it. $40, Agnes said. Everything I have that's liquid. Take it. Agnes, take it. There was no argument in her voice, only the firmness of a woman who has already decided. She set something else on the table alongside the purse. A newspaper folded open to the personal advertisements in the back pages. She had circled one item in pencil carefully as though she had been studying it. Clara pulled it toward her and read, Seeking educated wife. Mountain rancher in Colorado Territory seeks woman of character and practical skill for legal marriage. Medical knowledge strongly preferred. Isolated location, comfortable living, full partnership in working ranch. Serious inquiries only. Write to Ethan Calloway, Boulder Springs, Colorado Territory. Clara read it twice. Then she read it a third time more slowly. Medical knowledge strongly preferred. As though the man who placed this advertisement had somehow known in some impossibly specific way that there existed in the world a woman with exactly those qualifications who might need exactly this kind of escape. I was saving it to show you anyway, Agnes said. Before all of this, I thought perhaps after enough time had passed from your father's death, you might want... She stopped. It doesn't matter what I thought. What matters is that you write to him tonight. Emphasize your skills. Don't mention the trouble. Just go, Clara. Go as far as this country goes. Clara wrote the letter that night at Agnes's small kitchen table by the light of a single lamp. She told Ethan Calloway the true things, that she was the daughter of a Boston physician of some reputation, that she had worked alongside her father in his practice for 7 years, assisting in surgeries, managing medications, delivering babies when there was no time for anything more formal, that she was 22, unmarried, educated, and in need of a fresh beginning, far from everything she had known. She did not tell him about Victor. She did not tell him about the blood on her dress, or the body on the mahogany desk, or the 6 words that had reordered everything she thought she knew about her father's death. She sealed the letter and walked to the postbox on the corner at 11:30 at night, with the cold coming off the harbor and a thin sliver of moon overhead, and she stood there for a moment with the envelope in her hand. Then she let it go. The reply came 17 days later on a Wednesday afternoon when Agnes's landlady brought it upstairs with an expression of poorly concealed curiosity. Inside the envelope were three things: a note written in strong, angular handwriting that looked like it had been produced by a man more accustomed to fence posts than correspondence, a set of instructions for reaching Boulder Springs before the end of November, and $120 in bills. The note was brief. Miss Ashford, your qualifications are exactly what this ranch requires. I am a man of limited words and considerable expectations. If you are determined enough to make this journey before the winter closes, the passes come to Boulder Springs. We will speak plainly when you arrive and arrange matters to our mutual satisfaction. The winters here are long and the work is hard, and there is no room for pretense of any kind. If that suits you, come. If not, keep the money, and I wish you well. Ethan Calloway. Not a single flowery word, not a single false promise. Clara read it 3 times and felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight for 3 months. She left Boston the following morning. The train journey took 7 days and crossed a continent in stages that felt almost geological in their transformation. The dense brick and stone of the eastern cities gave way to farmland. The farmland opened into prairie that went on so long and so flat that Clara would press her forehead against the cold glass of the window and feel something strange and almost physical, as though the world were exhaling. Then finally the mountains, rising up on the horizon like a promise or a warning, she was not yet certain which. She had a small sleeping compartment, and she used the long nights to think rather than to sleep. She cataloged what she knew about Victor's evidence against her. She cataloged what she knew about Lawrence Duval. She thought about her father's final weeks with the precise, unemotional attention of a doctor reviewing case notes, pulling up details she had pushed down into grief and now needed back. The unusual tremors in his hands, the episodes of confusion that had been attributed to the fever, but had felt different somehow from fever confusion. The speed of his decline. She had not been suspicious then. She had been a daughter watching her father die. She had not had the distance that analysis requires. She had it now. On the afternoon of the 7th day, the train pulled into Denver, and Clara stepped onto the platform with her small carpet bag over one arm and her father's medical kit in the other. And she stood for a moment adjusting to the altitude and the western light, which was nothing like Boston, a light colder and clearer and somehow more honest. She saw them almost immediately. 2 men standing near the ticket window, dressed in suits that were too dark and too Eastern for the dusty wood and rough-edged energy of the Denver platform. One of them was speaking to the ticket seller. The other was scanning the crowd with a patience that Clara recognized because she had spent years learning to look at things the same way. Methodically, grid by grid. The one at the ticket window held something up briefly, a photograph. She could not see it clearly from where she stood, but she understood with absolute certainty what it contained. Her own face looking back. Clara did not run. Running draws attention, and attention was the one thing she could not afford. She turned slowly and walked in the opposite direction, maintaining the unhurried pace of a woman who knows exactly where she is going, even though she did not know where she was going at all. She moved through the platform and through the main hall and out through a side door that opened into a service alley and then into the maze of Denver's back streets. She abandoned her trunk. Everything in it was replaceable. The carpet bag she kept and the medical kit, because both of those she held with the grip of a woman who understands the difference between what can be lost and what cannot. She bought passage on the next stage to Boulder Springs at the first coaching office she found paying extra for immediate departure without explanation, and she sat in the dark interior of the coach as it pulled away from the Denver station and permitted herself one backward glance through the small rear window. The 2 men had emerged onto the street. They were standing together, looking not yet oriented toward the departing coach. Then the coach turned a corner, and Denver fell away behind her. The road to Boulder Springs deserved the word road only in the loosest possible sense. It was 2 days of rutted track climbing into mountains that looked from a distance like something from a painting and felt up close like something from a very different kind of story. The driver, a weathered man named Hutchins, who had the economy of speech that comes from decades of talking to horses instead of people, told her that a storm was building in the high passes. How bad, she asked. Bad enough, he said. We'll make it, but it'll be close. They made it with an hour to spare. The snow began as they rattled into Boulder Springs, which was less a town than a statement of human stubbornness against the surrounding wilderness. One main street, a general store, a saloon, a hotel, a small building with a weathered sign that read Sheriff. Everything built from the same raw timber as the mountains that surrounded it, and everything bearing the look of things that have survived winters and expect to survive more. Sheriff Amos Briggs met the coach in front of the general store. He was in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered, in a sheepskin coat, with a lawman's badge and a lawman's eyes, the kind that cataloged and retained. He introduced himself, confirmed her name with the care of a man who double-checks things, and told her that the Calloway brothers were already inside. Brothers, Clara said. Ethan Reed and Colt Briggs said, watch her face. They run the ranch together up in the high country, built everything themselves. 5 years, give or take. He paused. The advertisement didn't mention that. No, Clara said. It did not. Briggs looked at her steadily. They're good men, he said. Different from what you're used to, I'd expect. But good. Clara thought about what she was used to. She thought about Victor Hargrove wiping blood from a letter opener, with the calm of a man who had done this kind of thing before or expected to do it again. She thought about Lawrence Duval's eyes, which had looked at her twice in the parlor of her father's house with the assessing interest of a man deciding whether to purchase something. Different sounds fine, she said. She walked into the general store. The smell hit her first. Coffee and leather and wood smoke, and the dry warmth of a room heated by a cast-iron stove in the corner. Shelves lined every wall, stocked with flour and ammunition, and rope, and bolts of cloth, everything a life at altitude and distance from civilization required. And then she saw them. All three of them turned at the sound of the door, and the looking that she received in that moment was unlike anything she had experienced before. Not the polite assessment of Boston drawing rooms, not Victor's calculating inventory. Something else entirely. 3 pairs of eyes, gray amber, in a green so unusual it almost startled her, fixed on her, with a focused attention that felt like being walked into a wall of warmth on a cold day. Disorienting, not unpleasant. They were enormous. That was the first coherent thought. All three, that stood well over 6 feet, built in the way that men who have spent years doing actual physical work are built, with a density and solidity that has nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with necessity. Dark hair, similar features, the unmistakable shared architecture of brothers, dressed practically in flannel and denim and heavy boots. No performance, no effort. The tallest one stepped forward. He had gray eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been made by someone who believed in permanence. A scar bisected his right eyebrow, pale against tan skin. He moved with the economy of large men who have learned that the world is not built for their proportions. Miss Ashford, he said. His voice came from somewhere low in his chest, the kind of voice that carried across distances without effort. I'm Ethan Calloway. He did not extend his hand immediately. He looked at her face first with the directness she imagined he would look at weather or topography. Assessing, not unkind. These are my brothers, Reed. The one with amber eyes inclined his head. He had a warmth in his expression that his oldest brother did not, the kind of warmth that had been deliberately cultivated over years of making people feel at ease. And Colt, the youngest, met her eyes with those unusual green ones and the faintest suggestion of a smile. Not performed, genuine. The advertisement, Clara said, mentioned one man. It did, Ethan said. There was nothing apologetic in his tone. It was simply a fact being confirmed. We are 3 men. We are also one family. Those are not contradictions. I would have appreciated knowing you would have, he agreed, still without apology. Does it change your answer? Clara thought about what was waiting for her if she turned around. The 2 men in Denver who had her photograph. Victor Hargrove, who was patient and methodical and had already demonstrated his willingness to remove obstacles. Lawrence Duval, who had had 2 wives and who looked at women the way collectors look at acquisitions. Then she looked at the 3 men in front of her, at Ethan's gray eyes, which were hard and steady and entirely without pretense, at Reed's warmth, which felt genuine, at Colt's unusual stillness, the stillness of someone who observes more than he speaks and therefore tends to observe correctly. She thought about what her father had taught her about rapid assessment, about the difference between danger that announces itself and danger that conceals itself, about how to read a room and read the people in it when there is no time for anything more measured. She did not feel danger in this room. She felt something else, something she had not felt in any room for 3 months. Before she could speak, she noticed movement through the front window of the store. A rider coming in from the south, moving with the purposeful pace of someone who has been following something and has now found it. Clara looked once quickly and then looked away. "Is there a back door?" she said very quietly to Sheriff Briggs, who had followed her in. Briggs looked at her. His expression sharpened without dramatics, the way men who have lived by practical judgment shift when information changes. "What kind of trouble?" he asked, equally quiet. "The kind that followed me from Boston." Briggs did not ask for elaboration. He simply moved toward the back of the store, and Clara followed. And as she passed the counter, she was aware of Ethan Calloway turning to watch her with those gray eyes, and of something in his expression becoming very still, in the way that a man becomes still when he is preparing to act rather than react. The back door opened into a narrow alley that ran between the general store and the building beside it. Cold air hit her immediately, sharp and clean, in a way that Boston air had never been. Snow was falling heavier now, the flakes large and deliberate. She heard voices at the front of the store. An unfamiliar voice asking about a blonde woman, young, traveling alone, possibly arriving by stage from Denver. She heard Sheriff Briggs' voice from inside, flat and unhelpful. "Haven't seen anyone matching that description. Storm's coming in. Most folks are already headed home." Then she heard Ethan Calloway outside already. How he had gotten there she did not know, and he was lifting her onto a horse with a matter-of-factness that suggested this was simply the obvious next step in a sequence of obvious steps, his hands spanning her waist completely, the ease of it startling. Colt materialized from somewhere and mounted behind her, one arm coming around her waist solid and warm, the way a bulkhead feels in a storm. Ethan and Reed swung onto their own horses with the fluid ease of men who have been riding since before they could reason about it. And then they were moving, cantering out of town through back streets, heading north into the mountains that rose like walls against the darkening sky. The snow fell harder with every 100 yards. Within an hour, Clara could not see more than 10 feet ahead. The world had simplified itself entirely to white and dark and the sound of hooves and breathing and the wind through the pines. But Ethan rode at the front without hesitation, following trails that Clara could not see, navigating by some combination of instinct and memory and the knowledge of landscape that comes from years of belonging to a place rather than merely visiting it. And Reed rode to her right, and Colt's arm held her steady against him, and no one spoke because there was nothing to say that the situation did not already make plain. They rode for 2 hours. The altitude climbed. The pines thickened and then opened into a clearing, and there in the last gray light before full darkness stood the cabin. It was larger than she had imagined from an advertisement, built of thick logs with a stone chimney already trailing smoke as though the fire had been laid before they left that morning in anticipation of this return. Outbuildings clustered nearby, a barn, a smokehouse, a storage shed, and all of it solid and permanent and built to last, not built for appearances, but built for actual survival. Ethan dismounted and lifted Clara down. For a moment she was suspended, looking down into those gray eyes from above, and then her feet found the snow-covered ground, and he released her. "Welcome home," he said. 2 words, no ceremony, no sentiment, just a statement of fact offered as plainly as everything else he had said. Clara stood in the yard of a ranch in the Colorado mountains with snow falling on her hair and looked up at a sky that was dark and enormous and entirely full of stars, more stars than she had ever seen over Boston in her life. And she breathed in air that tasted of pine and altitude and clean cold. And she thought about her father writing her letters from his sickbed, in those final weeks, his handwriting increasingly unsteady, always telling her the same thing in different words. "You are stronger than you know, Clara. That is what medicine teaches you if you let it. Not how fragile life is, how persistent." The cabin door was open. Light and warmth spilled out across the snow. She picked up her carpet bag. She picked up her father's medical kit. She walked in. They fed her first because they were men who understood that a person who has been traveling for 2 days in November, weather needs food before she needs conversation. Venison and fried potatoes and coffee that was aggressively strong and they watched her across the rough wooden table with varying degrees of intensity, all three of them, as though she were something they had been waiting for and were not entirely sure was real. When the plates were cleared and the coffee poured again, Ethan folded his hands on the table and looked at her directly. "We'll talk plainly," he said. "That's what I promised in the letter, and that's what you'll get." Clara set down her cup. "All right." He looked at his brothers briefly, some wordless exchange that she would come to recognize over the months ahead as a language all its own built from years of proximity and shared work, and the understanding that passes between people who have survived things together. "We share everything on this mountain," Ethan said. "The land, the work, the risk. That's how we've always done it, and that's the only way it works up here." He paused. "We placed one advertisement. We want one wife, but we are three men, and we have always been three men, and that won't change." His gray eyes held hers without flinching. "In time, if you choose it, we would share that arrangement on as well. All three of us. We're not asking you to decide tonight or tomorrow or for some time yet, but I don't deal in half-truths, and you deserve to know the full terms before morning." The fire crackled. Outside, the blizzard had settled into the steady, committed snowfall of a storm that plans to stay. Clara looked at Ethan, then at Reed, whose amber eyes held both warmth and a patient uncertainty she had not expected to find there, then at Colt, who watched her the way he watched everything completely without performance, waiting to see what she actually was rather than what she appeared to be. She thought about the full terms. She thought about what she was practically in this situation. A woman who had run from one trap directly into a mountain in the middle of a blizzard, who had nowhere to go until spring and no resources with which to go anywhere regardless. She could be angry about the terms, or she could be honest with herself about the fact that these men had fed her and brought her out of the storm and were offering her something that, however unconventional they had, at least had the integrity to name clearly. "I won't decide tonight," she said. "No," Ethan agreed, "you won't. But I appreciate you saying it plainly." Something shifted in his expression, almost imperceptibly, but it was there. "That's all we ask," he said. "Think on it. Take the winter if you need it." She locked her door when she retired, not because she was afraid of them. She locked it because the habit of safety had become automatic, and because she needed one night alone with the weight of what had just been said, the frank, strange decency of it, the way it had been offered without pressure or manipulation. So unlike every negotiation she had endured in Boston that she almost didn't recognize it as one. She lay in the narrow bed and listened to the wind pressing against the walls and the low murmur of the brothers talking in the main room, their voices too quiet to make out words, just toned steady and familiar and entirely without drama. The most ordinary sound in the world. Three men talking before sleep. She thought about the full terms for a long time. She slept better than she had in 3 months. Morning came gray and cold and full of light reflected off snow. Clara dressed quickly in the warmest of the simple dresses that had been left folded on the chair beside her bed, dresses that fit her well enough to suggest someone had paid attention when they looked at her, and she braided her hair and went out to find the cabin already running. Reed was at the stove. The smell of coffee and something baking reached her before she had fully rounded the doorframe, and he looked up from whatever he was doing with a brief, easy nod that contained no social performance whatsoever. Just acknowledgement. Just good morning, expressed without the words. Ethan sat at the table with what appeared to be ledger books spread before him, a pen in his hand, his reading glasses, which surprised her. She had not pictured him with reading glasses perched on his nose. He did not look up immediately. When he did, he simply said, "Coffee's on," and returned to his column of numbers. Colt was outside. Through the window, Clara could see him in the yard splitting firewood with a rhythmic efficiency that was somehow both mechanical and graceful, his breath steaming in the cold air, his jacket thrown over the fence post, despite a temperature that must have been well below freezing. Each swing of the axe engaged his entire body, a clean arc from the shoulders, and the wood split with a crack that carried clearly through the glass. "He runs hot," Reed said from the stove, without turning around, which meant he had been watching her watch Colt. "Always has. We stopped arguing with him about the jacket about 4 winters ago." Clara poured herself coffee and sat down and said, "You grew up together." "We did," Reed said. "We're Missouri originally, then wherever the wagon took us, which was most places between Missouri and Colorado." He brought 2 plates to the table, pancakes thick and even, the kind that require attention to make properly, and sat across from her. Our parents were heading west for homestead land. Wagon axle broke on a mountain pass. A pause. That was 1866. Clara did the math quickly. Ethan would have been 20. Reed 19. Colt 15. Ethan kept you to diem, she said. Reed looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, a recognition of being accurately read. He did. Worked anything and everything for 4 years until we had enough to come up here and file the claim. He was quiet for a moment. He never once suggested splitting up. Not once. I don't think it occurred to him as a real option. Ethan came in from the yard just then, stamping snow from his boots, and the conversation ended with the natural efficiency of brothers who have long since learned when not to speak. He poured coffee, looked over the ledgers Reed had apparently set aside for him, and then looked at Clara. "There's work to show you today," he said, "if you're ready." "I'm ready," she said. The tour of the ranch was a practical document in the history of what 3 men with determination and no money could build in 5 years. The barn first, where 8 horses occupied stalls along one wall, with the ease of animals well cared for. 2 milk cows and a corner pen chickens in a separate section, everything arranged with a logic that was immediately apparent. Ethan moved through the space the way a man moves through a room he has built himself, with the ownership of someone who knows every board and bolt. Then the smokehouse hung with venison and elk and bear provisions, calculated to last 6 months if managed carefully. The workshop, where tools hung in deliberate order along one wall, and a half-finished rocking chair occupied the center workbench, its wood pail and smooth flowers carved along the back rail, with a precision that seemed at odds with the size of the hands responsible for them. Clara paused at the rocking chair, ran one finger along a carved pedal. "Who is this for?" she asked. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Someone who will need it," he said, and moved on. The final stop was the hot spring, 50 yards from the cabin, hidden among pines, steam rising from milky blue-green water, heated by something deep and geological and indifferent to the season. Ethan stopped at the tree line and said without ceremony, "This is yours. We don't come here without permission." "That won't change." Clara looked at the water, looked at him. The gift was not the spring itself. The gift was the line he had just drawn around it, clearly and without embellishment, because he understood that a woman living among 3 men in complete isolation needed something that was only hers. He had thought about it. He had decided before she arrived what the right thing to offer was. She thought about Victor Hargrove, who had understood her as an obstacle, about Lawrence Duval, who had understood her as an acquisition. She thought about how rarely she had encountered men who understood her as a person who might have needs worth respecting. "Thank you," she said. Ethan nodded and walked back toward the barn. The first real test came on the 6th day. Midnight, the tall black gelding in the end stall had caught his left foreleg on something in the dark, and by morning the cut was 4 inches long and bleeding steadily deep enough to require more than a bandage and good intentions. Ethan came to Clara's room before breakfast, knocked twice, and said through the door, "You said you could stitch wounds. One of the horses needs you." In the barn, in the gray morning light, Clara examined the injury with the focused calm her father had spent years cultivating in her. Clean wound, no tendon involvement, bleeding controlled but persistent. 12 stitches, minimum. She sent Colt for her medical kit without explanation, and he brought it without asking for one, which she noted. She worked by lantern light while Colt held Midnight's head, speaking to the horse in a continuous low murmur that was not quite words and not quite not words, something in between, that the animal responded to, with a gradual surrender of tension leaning into Colt's hands, the way something frightened leans toward the only warmth available. Ethan held the lantern. He said nothing. He simply held it at exactly the right angle and kept it there for however long she needed, with the patience of a man for whom stillness is not difficult. 12 stitches, neat and tight, the same spacing she would have used on a human patient. She bandaged the wound, gave clear instructions for monitoring and cleaning, and straightened up. Ethan was looking at her with an expression she had not yet seen on his face. Not the flat assessment of their first meeting, not the careful neutrality he seemed to maintain as a default. Something that had opened slightly at one corner. "Your father taught you well," he said quietly. It was simply an observation. It was also the first time he had spoken of her father in any real way, and the words landed differently than she expected, with a weight that had nothing to do with the sentence and everything to do with all the things that were contained in it. She looked down at her hands, still careful with the needle and thread she was returning to the kit, and she did not trust herself to speak for a moment. "He did," she said finally. Ethan nodded. He turned off the lantern and carried it back to its hook and went to look at the feed situation for the morning, because that was the kind of man he was. He felt things, and then he went and did practical work, and somehow that was more comforting than anything he might have said. The evenings became their own education. After dinner, when the work was done and the fire built up and the wind outside doing whatever the wind does at altitude in December, the four of them would sit. Clara had brought 2 books from Boston, the only books that had fit in her carpet bag, and she would read or she would simply sit, and the brothers would talk or not talk, and gradually the tension of strangers sharing a space began to ease into something else. On the 7th night, Reed told her about their parents. Not the bare facts she had already been given, but the texture of it. Their mother's insistence on reading aloud every evening regardless of how tired she was. Their father's habit of naming every horse they ever owned after a U.S. president, which meant they had had an Adams and a Madison and a Monroe and a Fillmore, and the Fillmore horse had been spectacularly bad-tempered, which their father had said was entirely in keeping with the historical record. Clara laughed at that, a real laugh, unprepared, the kind that comes before you can decide whether to let it. Reed watched her laugh with amber eyes that held something warm and something else underneath the warmth, something patient, the way a man looks at something he has been waiting for without knowing it. "You should do that more," he said. "Laugh, yes." "I haven't had many reasons recently," she said. "You might find more of them here than you expect," he said. On the 8th evening, Reed taught her to make bread from scratch. He positioned her at the wooden counter with a mound of dough, and he stood behind her to guide the motion of kneading, his large hands covering hers, and he was careful about proximity, maintaining the distance of a man who is aware of distance and has made a conscious decision about it. The lesson was real, the bread was real, and something else was also real, something that existed in the care he was maintaining and in the fact that he was maintaining it, which communicated more than contact would have. "Firm but even," he said. His voice was quiet, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath at her temple. "You're not fighting it, you're persuading it." "Is that a philosophy for bread specifically?" Clara said. "Or for other things as well?" Reed was quiet for a moment. "Both," he said. On the 10th evening, Colt sat down beside her at the fire without preamble and said, "You haven't talked about what you're running from." Clara looked at him. He met her eyes with the directness she had come to expect from him, the bluntness of a man who has decided that honesty is more efficient than tact and has organized his communication accordingly. "No," she agreed, "I haven't." "You don't have to," he said, "but we don't keep secrets between us. The 3 of us." He paused. "Whatever you decide to share with one of us, all 3 of us will know. That's how we work. I wanted you to know that before you tell any of us anything." Clara looked at the fire. She thought about the shape of what she was carrying, the murder she had witnessed, the confession she had received, the trap she was in. The things she had found in her father's final notes that she had not yet examined fully, not yet allowed herself to examine fully, because some part of her knew that when she did, what she found would require her to do something about it, and she was not yet sure what she had the power to do. "Someone I trusted hurt my father," she said carefully, "and then put me in a position where I had no legal standing to respond. So I came here." Colt was quiet for a moment. "And the men who followed you, employed by the person who hurt my father." Another pause. Colt looked into the fire. "He'll send more," he said. Not a question. "Yes," Clara said. "Or he'll come himself." Colt nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. He did not say anything else for a while. They sat by the fire in the easy silence that she had, without quite noticing it happening, learned to inhabit with these men, and then he said quietly, "We built this ranch so that nothing from down below could touch us. That was always the intention. You're part of this place now. What that means practically is that what threatens you also threatens us." Clara looked at him. "I'm not asking for your gratitude," he said. "I'm telling you the arithmetic of it." Then the 14th night arrived, and it arrived with its fist closed. Clara was reading by the fire alone for the first time in days, the brothers having retired early after a long day of reinforcing the barn's eastern wall against the weather. The wind had picked up after dark. The fire was burning steadily. The world outside the cabin was entirely white and entirely dark and entirely silent. And then there was a knock at the door. Clara was on her feet before she had consciously decided to stand. Her body understood things her mind was still processing. The knock had a quality she recognized, not the open, easy rap of someone expected. Something deliberate. Something that had calculated the exact force required. Ethan came out of the back room in the same moment, pulling on his shirt, gray eyes alert. He looked at her face, and whatever he saw there made him cross to the gun rack without hesitation and take down the rifle. Reed appeared behind him. Colt came in from the kitchen. Ethan opened the door. The man on the porch was nearly unrecognizable. Victor Hargrove was coated from collar to boot in snow, his lips pale with cold, his face drained to the color of the surrounding landscape. He had lost his hat somewhere on the mountain. His hands, she could see even from across the room, were shaking, but his eyes were exactly as she remembered them. Flat, patient, calculating even now, even like this. "Clara," he said. The sound of her name in his voice did something to the air in the room, a change in temperature that had nothing to do with the open door. "I didn't send men to do what I should do myself," he said. "You know me well enough to know that." Ethan stepped forward and blocked the doorframe with his body. "You'll want to identify yourself," he said in a tone that was entirely flat and entirely serious. "Victor Hargrove," Victor said, still looking past Ethan at Clara. "Her family." "He is not my family," Clara said. Victor almost smiled. "I've come a long way in difficult weather to have a conversation," he said. "The least you can do is let me freeze and thaw inside rather than outside." He was right that they could not leave him on the porch, not in this weather, not at this temperature, whatever he was. Ethan stepped back, his rifle held easy and clear in his right hand. Victor walked in, and Colt was immediately behind him, and when Victor reached into his coat with a movement that was perhaps reaching for warmth and perhaps reaching for something else, Colt had his arm in his coat pocket emptied of the small revolver inside it before Victor had finished the motion. Victor did not protest. He looked at Colt with those flat, pale eyes and said, "Efficient," and sat down in the chair nearest the fire without being invited to. Clara watched him. She did not move closer. She stood at exactly the distance that allowed her to see his face clearly and be out of arm's reach, and she held that distance with the stillness of a woman who has calculated it deliberately. "Whatever you've come to say," she said, "say it." Victor looked around the cabin, took in the three men positioned around him with the unhurried interest of someone conducting an assessment in a situation he appears to believe he controls. "I must admit, this is more than I expected from a newspaper advertisement," he said. "You've been industrious, Clara. Say what you came to say." Victor reached into his inner coat pocket, slowly watching Colt, who was watching his hands, and withdrew a folded document. He held it out toward Clara. She did not take it. "Then I'll summarize," Victor said, folding it back. "Lawrence Duval holds a legal debt instrument against your father's estate. $8,000 signed and notarized, established 6 months before Thomas Ashford's death. Debts do not disappear because their owner runs to the mountains, Clara. Duval has every legal right to pursue collection. In this case, the collection he prefers is the one your father agreed to before he died." The words landed precisely where Victor intended them to. Clara felt the trap's second jaw close, the one she had not seen until now. She had escaped Victor's direct reach. She had not escaped the machinery he had built beneath her. But she did not allow any of this to appear in her face. She held his gaze and said nothing, and the silence stretched, and Victor waited for her to break it, and she did not. It was Reed who spoke. "It's late," he said pleasantly from behind Victor. "You'll want to rest before we deal with any of this in the morning. Colt will show you to the storage room. There's a cot and blankets and enough wood to keep the cold out." He paused. "The door locks from the outside. I'm sure you understand." Victor looked at Reed and then at the three brothers arranged around him, and he did the arithmetic of the room in the same way Clara had seen him do arithmetic in his Boston office. Measured outcomes. Probabilities. He smiled very faintly in a way that meant something she did not yet understand, and stood and allowed Colt to escort him out. Clara stood in the empty room for a long moment after the back door closed. He's not afraid, she said. No, Ethan agreed. That means he has something else. Something beyond what he just showed us. Yes, Ethan said. She looked at him. He was watching her with those gray eyes steady and calm, the same way he'd watched weather without alarm and without pretense, and with the understanding that weather will do what it does, regardless of your feelings about it, and the only useful question is what you are going to do in response. I need my father's medical kit, she said. Ethan did not ask why. He retrieved it from her room and set it on the table in front of her and stepped back. Clara opened it. She had carried this kit for 7 days on a train and 2 days on a stagecoach and up a mountain in a blizzard. She had used it once for Midnight's leg, but she had not gone through it. Not fully, not the way she was about to go through it now. Her father's medical kit had been with him for 30 years. She knew every item in it. The needle cases and the catgut and the folded cloth squares and the brown bottles of tinctures and the scalpel handles and the smell of the interior antiseptic and worn leather. That was the smell of her father's hands when she was small, and he would come home from a long surgery and she would press her face against his sleeve. She went through each section, deliberately, completely. In the last section beneath the tray that held the suture materials, the lining of the kit was slightly raised at one corner. Clara had never noticed this before, which meant it had not always been this way. She pressed the corner down. It rose again, slightly too much material for the space. She turned the tray over. The lining on the underside had been cut and resealed along one edge with suture thread, tiny stitches, the kind that required skill and patience and a steady hand. The kind of stitches she would recognize in any context because she had spent years learning to make exactly this kind. Her father had sewn something into the lining. She cut the thread with the small scissors from the kit and reached inside and found a thin envelope folded twice to fit the space. Clara opened it. There were two things inside. The first was a single page of her father's handwriting, not the shaking, declining script of his last months, but something written earlier when his hand was still steady, a careful document in his professional hand listing dates and observations. Symptoms, timeline, specific details that she read with increasing precision and increasing certainty. The tachycardia that did not fit the respiratory presentation. The cognitive episodes that did not track with fever patterns. The quality of the tremors. Her father had written at the bottom of the page in the careful notation of a physician not consistent with consumption. Consider arsenic compounds long-term low-dose administration. He had known, he had suspected, and he had documented, and he had hidden the documentation in the one place he knew Clara would eventually search thoroughly because she was a doctor's daughter and she could not help it. The second document was longer. 3 pages written in legal language that Clara read slowly and with full attention. It was a copy of a will, her father's will, notarized in August of 1873, 3 years before his death, witnessed by Agnes Whitfield and a clerk of court whose name and seal were clearly printed at the bottom of the final page. The will left everything, the Beacon Street house, the medical practice, the savings, every asset Thomas Ashford possessed to his daughter, Clara Meridian Ashford, to be transferred in full upon her legal marriage or upon her 25th birthday, whichever came first. Victor Hargrove's name appeared nowhere in this document, not as beneficiary, not as executor, not in any capacity whatsoever. Clara sat at the table in the cabin with the document in front of her and the fire burning down and the wind pressing against the walls. She read it again. She read it a third time. She thought about the careful, deliberate love of a man who had understood that danger might come and had prepared for it the only way available to him quietly without telling her, because he could not tell her without putting her in danger before the danger was ready to show itself. Her father had known what Victor was, had known long enough in advance to plan for it, had hidden the plan in the one place he was certain it would eventually find her. She held the document against her chest for a moment with both hands, the way you hold something you are afraid of damaging. Then she set it carefully on the table and smoothed it flat. Reed came in from the back of the cabin. He saw her face. He sat down across from her without speaking and waited. And this was perhaps the most important thing about Reed Calloway. He had the patience to wait for what a person was ready to give. Victor Hargrove, Clara said. Made a mistake. Reed looked at the papers on the table, then back at her. What kind? He underestimated my father, she said. and he underestimated what a father will do when he knows his daughter is in danger and his own time is running short. She turned the documents so Reed could read them. He leaned forward and read carefully, unhurried, the way a man reads when he understands that the details matter. When he finished, he leaned back and was quiet for a moment. "The will," he said. "It makes Victor's claim to the estate entirely invalid." "Yes, and the medical notes establish that the death wasn't natural. Combined with Victor's own confession to me, witnessed by no one, which is worthless on its own." She paused. "But with these documents and with testimony from Agnes Whitfield, who witnessed both the will and my father's final months, and with whatever evidence a competent investigator could develop from the medical record, Victor doesn't go back to Boston with you in custody," Reed said. "He goes back to face a murder charge." Clara looked at the fire. "I need to get this to someone with the authority to act on it. Federal authority, not local." She thought of the two men in Denver with her photograph. "Victor has reach in the Boston legal establishment. Whatever I bring has to be bulletproof before it gets anywhere near a Boston courtroom." Reed was quiet for a moment. Then, "There's a Pinkerton agent been through Boulder Springs twice in the past 6 months. Briggs mentioned it. He's been looking into something connected to the Boston financial circuit." He paused. "Briggs might know how to reach him." Clara looked at him. "Ethan needs to hear all of this," she said. "Yes," Reed agreed. "He does." She gathered the documents carefully, the will and the medical notes, and held them with both hands and stood up. The fire was burning low. Outside the cabin, the blizzard had settled into the quiet, relentless snowfall of a storm that plans to stay, and Victor Hargrove was locked in the storage room with his plans, whatever those plans were, and somewhere down the mountain, the world that had built the trap she was in was waiting. But the trap, Clara thought, looking at the documents in her hands, looked somewhat different now than it had 2 hours ago. Her father had given her a key. Now she had to find the door. The months that followed were a different kind of winter than Clara had expected. She had anticipated endurance, long dark days of waiting for the snow to melt and the roads to open, and the legal machinery she was building, slowly and by correspondence, to accumulate enough mass to move on its own. She had anticipated patience exercised against her nature, against the part of her that wanted to act immediately and decisively and was constrained by geography and season from doing so. What she had not anticipated was learning. It happened gradually without announcement. She learned the rhythm of the ranch the way you learn a language, first with conscious effort and then one morning with the startling realization that you have stopped translating. She learned which horses required patience and which required confidence, and which, like midnight, required both at once and in the right order. She learned to read weather by the behavior of the birds in the pines, which Colt taught her with the same low, unhurried methodology he applied to everything. She learned that Reed's singing in the kitchen meant the day was going to be manageable, and that his silence meant something was working in him that needed space, and that the right response to both was to let them be exactly what they were. She learned that Ethan Calloway, beneath the granite exterior he presented to the world as consistently as a mason presents a finished wall, was a man who made things. Not just structures, though he made those with the focus of someone for whom building is a form of thinking. He made things for specific people with specific thought behind them. The rocking chair she had admired on her first tour of the workshop appeared outside her door one February morning, without explanation or ceremony, finished and sanded smooth, the carved flowers along its back rail, including a small, precise rendering of a lily that she had mentioned in passing exactly once as her mother's favorite flower. She stood looking at it for a long time before she could go in for breakfast. Through Sheriff Briggs's monthly mail runs, she wrote to Agnes Whitfield in Boston. Agnes wrote back. The letters contained information carefully worded about the state of things in the city, about Thomas Crane's family who had hired outside investigators, about a name that appeared in 2 of those letters with increasing frequency, Agent Harlan Voss Pinkerton, National Detective Agency, operating out of the Chicago office, with a current assignment that touched the Boston financial circuit, and several names Clara recognized from her father's professional correspondence. Victor remained in the storage room with adequate food and a cot in the company of his own thoughts. He had been saying progressively less since mid-January, when Clara had informed him through the locked door that she had found her father's medical notes and his will, and that she intended to use both. He had been quiet for a very long time after that, Then he had said through the door, "You can't prove intent. Medical notes are not confessions." No, Clara had agreed, but they were the beginning of a case, combined with a will that invalidates your entire claim to the estate and testimony from a credible witness in Agnes Whitfield, and whatever a Pinkerton investigator can build from the financial records, they become something considerably harder to dismiss. She had paused. "You told me yourself what you did, Victor. I was the only one in the room. That's worthless in court, you're right. But it matters to me. It tells me what kind of case I'm looking for and what kinds of evidence will support it." Another long silence. "You're more like your father than I realized," he had said finally. Clara had not responded to that. She had gone back to the cabin and sat by the fire and allowed herself to feel what she needed to feel about that sentence privately for as long as it required. Then she had gone to help Reed with dinner. She had also in those winter months been making a different kind of decision. Not the frantic, cornered decisions of November, with Victor's deadline pressing against her and the blood on her dress still vivid in her memory, but the slower, more honest kind that comes when the immediate danger has receded enough to leave room for other questions. The kind of questions that begin, "If I had a real choice with no trap behind any of the doors, what would I choose?" She had been working on that answer since January. By February, she had it. The wedding was the smallest possible size for a wedding conducted by a county sheriff in a frontier town with the snow still at windowsill height. Briggs performed the ceremony in his office with Reed and Colt as witnesses. Clara wore the best of the dresses that had been left for her in the cabin, a deep blue she had not owned before, and that she suspected Reed had ordered from the dry goods catalog without mentioning it. Ethan stood beside her in his best flannel shirt, which he had pressed with a thoroughness that suggested he had spent some time on it. The ceremony was brief and entirely without sentiment, because the law does not require sentiment, only consent and witnesses. She signed her name, Clara Ashford Calloway, and the ink dried, and Ethan looked at his copy of the certificate for a moment before folding it with the care of a man filing an important document. She felt afterward something she was still in the process of identifying. Not relief exactly, something more like ground becoming solid underfoot after a long time of uncertain footing. It was March when the balance shifted. The snow was still deep, but the quality of the light had changed, carrying something warmer in it, something that suggested the world remembered what it was like before winter and was beginning to remember in earnest. The passes would open within weeks, and Victor Hargrove, who had spent 3.5 months in the storage room, would need to be dealt with before any of that happened. Clara would not understand the full weight of that morning until later, looking back from a porch 10 years distant with the sound of her children in the yard below. But she would mark it as the pivot point, the moment the architecture of everything changed quietly and permanently, like a mountain adjusting to the weight of a new season. Victor had stopped smiling, and Victor Hargrove, she had come to understand, only stopped smiling when he had run out of cards to play. The morning the snow began to melt in earnest, Ethan came to the door of her room before breakfast and said, "Briggs sent word up with young Hennessy from the Clover Creek Ranch. There's a man waiting in Boulder Springs who says he's been waiting since February." "Voss," Clara said immediately. "That's the name," Ethan said. They went down the mountain the same day, all four of them. Victor secured on a spare horse with his hands bound in front of him by a length of rope that Colt had knotted with the efficiency of a man who has tied things that need to stay tied. Victor said nothing during the descent. Boulder Springs in March was a different place from Boulder Springs in November. The snow was pulling back from the main street, revealing the raw timber and packed earth beneath. And the air had something expectant in it, the energy of a frontier town that has survived another winter and is beginning to believe in spring again. Sheriff Amos Briggs was waiting in front of his office with a man Clara had not seen before. He was in his early 40s, lean and deliberate in his movements, wearing a coat that was good quality without being conspicuous. He had the eyes of a man who spent his professional life noticing things and had gotten very good at it. "Miss Ashford," Briggs said, then he corrected himself with a slight nod. "Mrs. Calloway." Clara looked at Agent Harlan Voss and extended her hand the way her father had taught her to extend it, directly without qualification. "Agent Voss," she said. He shook it and regarded her with the assessing attention of a professional who has learned not to be surprised by what he finds. "Mrs. Calloway, I've been developing information on Victor Hargrove for 7 months. I understand you have direct testimony and documentary evidence that may complete what I have." I have my father's medical notes documenting symptoms consistent with long-term arsenic poisoning, Clara said. I have a copy of his actual will notarized in 1873, establishing that Victor's claim to the Ashford estate is legally invalid. I have Victor's verbal confession of intent unwitnessed and therefore not independently admissible but useful for understanding the shape of what you're looking for. She paused. And I have Victor himself, who has been a guest on the Callaway Ranch for the past 3.5 months. Voss looked past her at Victor, who was sitting on his horse with bound hands and flat, pale eyes, and for the first time something that might have been professional satisfaction crossed Voss's face. 3.5 months, Voss said. The passes were closed, Clara said. A corner of Voss's mouth moved fractionally. Mrs. Callaway, I think you and I have a great deal to discuss. They spent the better part of the day in Sheriff Briggs' office, with Victor locked in the single cell at the back of the building, and the documents spread across Briggs's desk. Voss had brought his own files, 7 months of patient work following the financial trail from a series of fraudulent transactions in the Boston business community that traced back always to the same two names, Victor Hargrove and Lawrence Duval. It was during this conversation that Clara learned about Duval. Voss mentioned it without preface, the way he delivered most information as a clean fact to be recorded and assessed. Lawrence Duval had died in the Denver City Jail in January, killed in an altercation with another prisoner. He had been arrested in November on a separate matter, financial fraud connected to a land speculation scheme that had defrauded several Colorado investors and had been awaiting trial when he died. Clara heard this and was quiet for a moment. She had been afraid of Lawrence Duval's name for months. Not the man precisely, she had only met him twice, but the name as Victor willed it, the legal instrument. The debt Victor claimed Duval held against her father's estate. The mechanism by which Victor intended to reach her, even here, even in Colorado, even behind 3 men and a winter's worth of mountain. That mechanism had dissolved in January, and no one had told her because no one had known to tell her. Victor had been sitting in the storage room with his one remaining card already dead. He knew, Clara said. Voss looked at her. When he came up the mountain in November, she said, Duval was already in custody by then. Victor knew the debt instrument was worthless. He came anyway. She thought about Victor's smile when Colt had locked him in the storage room, the specific quality of that smile. He came to see what I had. He wanted to know how much I knew and whether I had evidence he needed to worry about. He intended to find out and then act accordingly. Voss was quiet for a moment. And you locked him in the storage room instead. My husband and his brothers locked him in the storage room, Clara said precisely. I found the evidence. The distinction mattered to her, not because she needed anyone to understand it immediately, but because she understood it, and that was enough. Voss looked at the medical notes again, then at the will. He turned the will over in his hands with the tactile focus of someone who has learned to trust what he can feel as much as what he can read. This is enough, he said. 2 words delivered without drama. Clara felt them settle in her chest like stones finding the bottom of still water. The will alone dismantles his financial claim and exposes the fraud he committed against the estate, Voss continued. The medical notes combined with what I have from the Boston pharmaceutical records. There was a purchase of arsenic compounds from a chemist on Winter Street 18 months before Dr. Ashford's death, signed under a false name, but traceable to a billing address connected to Hargrove's business build, the foundation for a murder charge. He paused. We'll need Agnes Whitfield's testimony, and the Crane family's investigator has witness statements from 2 of Hargrove's former employees that establish a pattern of behavior. Then it's enough, Clara said. It's enough, Voss confirmed. She had imagined this moment not with the specific details of a sheriff's office in Boulder Springs and a Pinkerton agent with careful hands and Ethan standing behind her with Reed and Colt flanking him like the 2 halves of something completed. She had imagined it in the abstract, the way you imagine getting through something difficult, when the difficulty is still in front of you and imagination is all you have. The reality was quieter than she had expected. Less like triumph and more like exhaling. As though she had been holding her breath since November, since August, since the day she had stood at her father's grave and felt something not quite add up, and her body was only now in this small office smelling of wood smoke and old paper, beginning to believe it was allowed to breathe again. She looked at the cell at the back of the office. I want to speak with him, she said. Briggs looked at Voss. Voss looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Clara. Loan, she said. There was a pause that contained several conversations that did not need to be spoken aloud. Then Ethan said very quietly, "We'll be right outside the door." He meant it exactly as he said it, not as a threat, not as a limitation, as information. She would not be alone in the building, and he was informing her of that fact and leaving the rest entirely to her. This she had come to understand was how Ethan Calloway expressed love. In facts, in presences, in the rocking chair outside her door with the lily carved into the back rail placed there without comment, because comment would have been unnecessary. She walked to the back of the office. Victor looked up when she stopped in front of the cell. He was sitting on the narrow cot with his coat folded across his knees, and he looked older than he had in November, not in a way that suggested weakness, but in a way that suggested the aging that comes from calculation with no remaining yield. His eyes were still flat, but something in them had shifted, or perhaps what had shifted was her ability to read what had always been there. "Your father's medical kit," he said. "I should have taken it." "Yes," Clara said. "You should have." "I didn't understand what it meant to him." A pause. "I underestimated a physician's attachment to his instruments." "You underestimated a father's attachment to his daughter," Clara said. "The instruments were incidental." Victor was quiet for a moment. "What do you want from this conversation?" Clara had thought about this for 3 months in the way you think about something you know you will eventually have to do and do not want to do badly. She had wanted in some of those months to want revenge, the hot, immediate kind that is mostly about pain and very little about justice. She had found when she was honest with herself that she did not want it. What she wanted was something cooler and more durable. "I want you to understand," she said, "that my father knew what you were doing. Not at the end, not when he was too weak to act on it, but early enough to prepare. Early enough to write down what he observed and hide it where I would find it and make certain that what he built would reach me regardless of what you took." She paused. "He was smarter than you, Victor. He was simply also kinder, and kindness takes longer to accomplish its purposes than cruelty does. But it gets there." Victor looked at her for a long moment. "He raised you to believe that," he said. "He raised me to know it," she said. "There's a difference." She walked back to the front of the office. Voss was organizing his documents with the methodical efficiency of a man packing a case he expects to carry a long distance. Briggs was refilling the coffee pot. Ethan, Reed, and Colt stood near the door, and as she came through from the back, Ethan looked at her face with a question in his eyes that he did not ask aloud, and she answered it by walking to stand beside him. And after a moment, his hand found the small of her back, just briefly, just enough. Victor Hargrove was transported to Denver that same afternoon under Voss's custody to await transfer to Boston to face charges. The weather held long enough for the party to make decent time, and Clara stood in the street with the three brothers and watched the small procession move south until the road curved and the pines took them. Then she breathed. Summer came to the Colorado high country the way it always does, with an enthusiasm that seemed disproportionate to the brevity of its stay. The meadows below the cabin opened into wildflowers. The horses grew sleek and energetic. The days lengthened past what Clara had believed days were capable of, the sky still pale at 9 in the evening, the mornings arriving with a clarity that made everything look slightly more real than it had any right to be. In July, a telegraph came up from Briggs with the weekly rider. Clara read it at the kitchen table twice and then set it flat on the wood and looked out the window at the yard where Colt was working a young gray horse in slow, patient circles, and at the barn door where she could see Reed's silhouette moving in the interior dimness, and at the fence line where Ethan was mending a section that had heaved in the spring thaw, moving with the absorbed focus he brought to physical work, as though each task was a problem that deserved his full attention until it was solved. The telegraph was from Agnes Whitfield in Boston. Victor Hargrove had been found guilty on 2 counts: the murder of Thomas Crane, for which the Crane family's evidence had been decisive, and the deliberate poisoning of Dr. Thomas Ashford, for which Clara's medical documentation and Voss's pharmaceutical records and Agnes's testimony had collectively built something the defense could not dismantle. The sentence for both was death. The execution had been carried out the previous week. The will had been entered into probate. The Ashford estate was legally Clara's. She had a house on Beacon Street, a medical practice with an established patient list. $12,000 in savings. A life in Boston fully restored, waiting for her like a room that had been kept against her eventual return. She sat with this for a while. She gave it the full weight of honest attention it deserved. Then she picked up the pen and paper that Ethan kept by the window for correspondence, and she wrote 2 telegraphs. The first was to Agnes Whitfield. She asked Agnes to locate a reliable solicitor and instruct him to list the Beacon Street house for sale at fair market value. She asked Agnes to use a portion of the proceeds to ensure her own comfort and security for the years ahead, because Agnes had given her $40 in the most important newspaper in the history of Clara's life, and that was worth considerably more than a solicitor's fee. She asked Agnes to send the remaining funds once the sale closed to a bank account that she would establish in Boulder Springs. The second telegraph was to a physician she had read about in one of the Denver newspapers that Briggs occasionally sent up with the monthly mail, a Dr. Emmett Haverford, who had been attempting to establish a medical practice in the Boulder Springs area, but lacked the capital to build proper facilities. She introduced herself, noted her qualifications, and suggested a meeting at his earliest convenience to discuss a joint proposition involving premises that could be funded and built in the spring. She signed both telegraphs, Clara Ashford Calloway. She folded them and walked outside into the July afternoon, warm and smelling of pine and the sweetness of high country grass, and she crossed the yard to where Ethan was working at the fence line. He heard her coming and turned the way he always turned, with his full attention, the way he gave everything his full attention when he decided it warranted it. She held out the 2 telegraphs. He read them, both of them carefully the way he read the ledgers. Then he looked up. "The house," he said. "You're selling it." "I am," she said, a pause. "You're certain?" "I'm certain," she said. He looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes, and she could see the question beneath the one he had asked, the real question, the same one he had been sitting with since February, since the wedding and the signed certificate, and the so careful business of 2 people becoming something to each other in the way that actual lasting things are built, without rush, without pretense, with a great deal of attention to whether the foundation will hold. She answered the real question by taking the telegraphs back from him and folding them into her apron pocket and saying, "The lumber yard in Boulder Springs will need a delivery order for the clinic build. I thought you might know the most efficient way to arrange that." Ethan looked at her for another moment. Then something shifted in his face, the same thing that had shifted when she had said, "I trust you," in the barn over Midnight's wounded leg. The slight opening in the wall that he maintained around everything he actually felt, the glimpse of what was behind it. "I'll ride down Thursday," he said. "Sort it out in person." "Thank you," Clara said. She went back inside to start dinner. The news from Boston continued to arrive in pieces through the summer, carried up by Briggs's monthly rider, and occasionally by Voss himself, who passed through twice more on his way to other cases, and seemed to have developed the habit of stopping at the Calloway Ranch with updates as though it were a regular way station on his route, which perhaps it had become. The Ashford estate settled cleanly. Agnes was taken care of. The Crane family sent a formal letter of thanks that arrived in August, 3 pages, in an elderly gentleman's careful handwriting, expressing gratitude for the evidence and the testimony that had finally resolved what his family had spent 2 years trying to resolve. Clara read the letter 3 times and then put it carefully in the box she had begun keeping for documents that mattered. The clinic proposition was agreed upon. Dr. Haverford, who turned out to be a good-natured man in his mid-30s with solid training and insufficient capital, came up the mountain in August to meet Clara and left having shaken hands on a partnership that would begin construction the following spring. The Calloway Ranch grew quietly and by accumulation, the way strong things grow. Colt's instinct with horses had developed into something that was beginning to draw attention from ranchers further afield, men who had heard about the Calloway stock and made the trip up the mountain and generally left having spent more money than they intended to. Reed's Cooking had, without anyone quite deciding this was the official arrangement, expanded to feed whatever number of people happened to be at the table, which was increasingly more than 4. And Clara's medical skills had begun in the organic way of needs finding available solutions to serve the broader community. A neighboring rancher's wife sent for her in July when her own confinement went badly, and Clara rode down and handled it, and both mother and child had done well. After that, the word went around the mountain families the way necessary information travels in isolated communities quickly and completely. By September, she had attended 4 more families. She was building something. The realization came to her quietly on an evening in early September when she was sitting on the porch of the cabin in the last light of the day, watching Reed and Colt argue amiably about something involving a fence post, while Ethan observed them with the expression of a man who knows the argument will resolve itself and is not inclined to hurry it along. She had come here running. That was true, and she would not pretend it wasn't. She had come here with blood on her dress and her father's murderer, 3 days behind her and $40 in a medical kit, in the kind of desperation that makes a newspaper advertisement in the back pages of a Boston broadsheet look like a legitimate plan. But she was not running now. She had not been running for a long time. At some point she could not precisely identify. She had stopped moving away from something and started moving towards something, and the difference between those two directions was the difference between the woman who had stood in Victor's office and barely breathed, and the woman sitting on this porch in the September light, watching the people she loved argue about fence posts. She put her hand on her stomach. She had been sitting with this knowledge for 3 weeks, with the combination of certainty and not yet readiness that precedes telling someone important something that will change everything. She was certain of the knowledge itself. She was a doctor's daughter, and she understood her own body with precision. She had been less certain about the right moment. Looking at the yard at Ethan turning from the fence argument to look at her as he always seemed to know when she was looking at him, she decided the right moment was dinner. It was a Tuesday evening. Reed had made a venison roast with the herbs he had been drying since early summer, and the cabin smelled of it from 20 yards away, and they ate the way they always ate, with the focused attention of people who have worked hard and are genuinely hungry and appreciate good food without feeling the need to say so. When the plates were set aside and the coffee poured, Clara put both hands flat on the table. "I'm pregnant," she said. The silence that followed was unlike any other silence she had experienced in this cabin, and she had experienced several varieties. This one had a texture to it, a density, as though the air itself had changed composition. Reed looked at his coffee cup, then he looked up. He opened his mouth and then closed it and shook his head, once the small gesture of a man who has started a question he has already recognized as the wrong question. Colt's expression moved through several things in quick succession: surprise, and then something that expanded in his eyes and seemed to fill his entire face. Not just the eyes, but the set of his jaw and the way he was holding himself in his chair, as though he was trying to contain something too large for ordinary sitting. Ethan looked at her, straight at her, the way he always looked at her, with the full weight of his attention. And she saw something in his face that she had only seen a handful of times in the months she had known him. The wall entirely down. Everything behind it visible, unguarded, unmistakable. "She belongs to all of us," Clara said. "That is the only answer that matters on this mountain." Reed made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else entirely. He put one hand over his face for a moment. Colt stood up and then sat back down and then stood up again and then laughed at himself, which was uncharacteristically uncoordinated for a man who generally moved through the world with complete physical certainty. Ethan reached across the table and put his hand over hers. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Everything he might have said was already in the contact, in the steadiness of his hand, and the way he was looking at her with those gray eyes that were, she noticed, very bright in the firelight. She looked at Reed, who had taken his hand from his face and was looking at her with tears he was making absolutely no effort to hide, which was so perfectly in keeping with everything she knew about Reed Calloway that it made something in her chest ache with a warmth that was almost painful. She looked at Colt, who was sitting with his hands pressed flat on his thighs in an expression of such unguarded joy that she thought she had never seen anything so purely itself in all her life. She looked at Ethan, who was still holding her hand and still looking at her, and who said very quietly, "Your father would have been glad." She had to close her eyes for a moment at that. "Yes," she said when she could, "he would have." The clinic opened the following April, small building on the edge of Boulder Springs with the words Ashford Calloway Medical painted on a sign above the door that Ethan had cut and lettered himself, working on it for 3 weeks in the winter evenings, while he thought no one was watching, though she had watched from the doorway more than once without saying anything, which she suspected he knew. The baby arrived in April as well, 2 weeks before the clinic opening, which was both inconvenient and entirely appropriate, since Clara had by then accepted that the life she was building had its own ideas about scheduling. Ethan delivered his daughter with hands that shook for the first and only time she had ever seen them shake. guided by Clara's voice through the final stages, because she remained, even in this, the person with the most relevant professional knowledge, and she intended to use it. The baby was small and healthy and arrived in the early morning with the indignant energy of someone who has been somewhere comfortable and objects to being asked to leave. Clara held her and looked at her face and thought about her father's handwriting in the lining of the medical kit, and about a lily carved into the back rail of a rocking chair, and about the specific, ordinary miracle of being alive in a place you have chosen. They named her Rose. Not for any particular rose. For the general idea of roses which bloom where they are planted, which persist through winters, which are less fragile than they appear. 10 years later, Clara Ashford Calloway stood on the porch of the house that had grown room by room to accommodate the life inside it and looked down at the yard below. Rose was 10, serious and precise, helping 6-year-old Nora with her letters in the methodical way of a child who has absorbed from somewhere her mother's belief that knowledge is the most durable thing a person can carry. Emma was 7, Reed's amber eyes and a face that was otherwise entirely her own, currently conducting what appeared to be a negotiation with one of the chickens. Wren was 4, small and watchful, following Colt around the yard with the absorbed attention of a student who has found her teacher. And the twin boys, James and Samuel, were 3 and inseparable, involved in something involving a length of rope that Clara watched for a moment before deciding it was not yet urgent enough to interrupt. The ranch was 500 acres now. The horse breeding program Colt had developed over a decade was known throughout the territory. The clinic served families across a 30-mile radius and doctor. Haverford had taken on 2 additional physicians to handle the patient load, and Clara continued her own practice from a room in the house on the days she could not make it down to town. Ethan was at the fence line. He was 42, and his dark hair had silver in it at the temples, and he moved with the same powerful economy he had always moved with, and every once in a while he would look up from the work and find her on the porch with an accuracy that still sometimes startled her, as though he carried some instrument that detected her presence regardless of distance or angle. Reed was in the kitchen. She could hear him faintly singing something she did not recognize, one of the old songs he had been singing in that kitchen for 10 years, without apparent concern for whether anyone was listening. Colt was in the corral with the new gray filly, his voice too low to hear from the porch, just his hands moving on the animal's neck in the long, patient strokes that she had watched him make 1,000 times. Clara put her hand on her stomach, feeling the flutter that had become familiar over the past weeks. The 6th, she had not told them yet. She admitted to herself with something that had become comfortable enough to call amusement, enjoying knowing for a little while before it became the joyful disruption it always became. The crying, the hands over faces, Colt standing and sitting and standing again. Ethan's hand over hers perfectly steady, his eyes entirely unguarded. Ethan looked up from the fence line and found her on the porch. She raised one hand briefly. He returned the gesture, then he went back to the fence. She had come here running from death, from a dead father and a murderer's trap, and the loneliness of being made legally invisible in a world that preferred her that way. She had come here with $40 and a medical kit and a letter from a man of few words and considerable expectations. She was not running now. She was standing on the porch of a house she had helped build in a life she had chosen and continued to choose every single day, watching 5 of her children negotiate their Tuesday morning, listening to Reed sing in the kitchen, watching Ethan at the fence line, knowing that when she went inside and set the medical kit on the table and opened it to check the inventory she performed every month as a matter of professional habit, she would feel the worn leather of the handles under her hands and think of her father. He had given her the key. She had found the door. Everything on the other side of it had been hers to build, and she had built it. Board by board, year by year, choice by choice, the same way Ethan had taught her to understand building, which was not a single dramatic act, but 10,000 small ones, each one dependent on the last and carrying the weight of the next. She thought about the woman who had stood in Victor Hargrove's office 4 blocks from Beacon Street, with blood on her dress and a cold, precise purpose forming in her chest, and she recognized her, and she was glad she had been that woman when she needed to be. She thought about the newspaper folded open on Agnes Whitfield's kitchen table and the pencil circle around a few lines of text, and the $40 in a leather purse, and the way the world's smallest and most ordinary kindnesses can redirect the entire course of a life. She thought about a lily carved into a rocking chair by a man who said almost nothing and meant everything he did not say. She thought about Reed singing in a kitchen he had made into something better than shelter, and Colt's hands on the neck of a frightened animal patient. And sure, and the way of family is not always the shape it looks like from the outside, and is always exactly what it is from within. Rose called something from the yard below some directive to young Nora involving the proper conduct of a lesson, and Nora's reply was indignant and immediate. And Emma looked up from her chicken negotiation long enough to take a side, and James and Samuel dropped their rope entirely in favor of watching the disagreement, and Wren turned to Colt and said something that made him laugh, loud and unguarded, the laugh she had loved from the first time she heard it. Ethan looked up from the fence line at the sound of it. He looked at Clara on the porch. She looked back at him. He nodded once the way he nodded when something was exactly as it should be, and he wanted her to know that he knew it. She went inside. The medical kit was on the shelf where she kept it between the ledger books and the correspondence box. She lifted it down and set it on the kitchen table and opened it, and she went through it the way she always went through it, methodically, completely checking every item against the list her father had written in his careful professional hand on the inside of the lid, a list she had memorized years ago but still checked, because he had taught her that the difference between a good physician and a careless one is not talent but habit. She touched each item in turn. The needle cases, the catgut, the folded cloth squares, the brown bottles of tinctures, each one in its place, the scalpel handles, the scissors small and precise that had cut the suture thread from her father's secret and given her back everything she needed to fight for. She pressed her palm flat against the worn leather of the interior and held it there for a moment, the way you hold something you love and do not want to take for granted. Then she took a piece of paper from the correspondence box and a pen from the inkwell, and she sat down at the kitchen table in the afternoon light, and she began to write, because there was a family on the far side of the mountain that had sent for her, and there was a new child coming in the spring, and there was work to do, and there had always been work to do, and she had always done it. Outside, Reed's singing moved through the kitchen walls as though walls were merely a suggestion. Outside, the children argued and laughed and fell down and got up again. Outside, Ethan came in from the fence line, and she could hear his boots on the porch steps, the familiar weight of him, and then the door, and then the sound of the coffee pot being lifted from the stove. "Clinic needs you Thursday," he said from the doorway. "I know," she said without looking up from the letter. "I'm writing to the Hennessy family first. Their youngest has the fever." A brief silence, then the sound of a chair being pulled out. Ethan sat down across from her and poured 2 cups and set one near her hand without interrupting her writing, and opened his own ledgers, and they worked in the same room in the same silence they had been working in for 10 years. The silence of 2 people who know each other well enough to share quiet without filling it, who have built something together that does not need to be spoken about to be understood. The afternoon light moved across the table between them. Somewhere in the house, a child laughed. Clara finished the letter, folded it, and reached for her coffee cup and looked across the table at Ethan, who was making a note in his ledger with that same absorbed precision he brought to everything, the silver at his temples catching the light from the window. He looked up the way he always looked up when she looked at him. She said, "I have something to tell you." He set his pen down. He looked at her with his full attention, all of it unheld, unguarded, the gray eyes entirely open. She smiled. "We're going to need to add another room," she said.